On the first day of spring, March 19th. Hopefully everything is working. I made a few updates, so fingers crossed, and here goes. So we're going to look at the Old Testament reading from Numbers, and it talks about all of the different sacrifices that we have that are prescribed in the Old Testament for the Old Testament people of Israel. So, as we go through the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, we see these sacrifices mentioned over and over again. It's all throughout. So, as we look at, for example, the construction of the altar for the burnt offering in Exodus 29, there we see the morning and evening sacrifices mentioned. And then Leviticus chapters 1 through 7 talks about how the different sacrifices, the different types of sacrifices are to be performed. Then Leviticus 23 lists all the different festivals and how they related to the layperson. Then Numbers 15 prescribes all the cereal offerings and libations that should accompany the animal sacrifices. Now, here in Numbers 28 and 29, we see that what we have is a listing of the type and the number of sacrifices that must be offered on every day of the year by the priests for the nation as a whole. So this list is especially for the priesthood, as it were, so that they have this all organized and laid out ahead of time and know what to expect all throughout the year. So here, as we look at this list, it lists the minimum number of sacrifices that can be offered in a year. Extra sacrifices like those brought forward by lay people are just that, extra sacrifices. So why do we have this listing here in Numbers? Well, it's a good time to reaffirm the promise that was given to Joshua and the rest of the people, because God would bless them. And every year in the future, the priests would have to sacrifice 113 bulls, 32 rams, 1,086 lambs, and offer up more than a ton of flour and 1,000 bottles of oil and wine. So clearly, God will prosper Israel in the promised land. These laws of sacrifice, in addition to being laws, also sound a triumphant note that grows ever louder as they draw near to the border of Canaan and are about to make entry into the promised land. So, the sacrifices that we look at now, if I can show you this chart, hopefully I do that properly. The sacrifices are arranged according to their frequency. First comes the daily burnt offerings, then second comes the weekly Sabbath offering, third is the monthly offering, and finally there are the once yearly offerings arranged in chronological sequence. Notice that as we have these numbers here, they are cumulative. What does that mean? So on the Sabbath, you'll notice there are both the daily sacrifices that are offered of 2 lambs and also the Sabbath sacrifice of 2 lambs. So the cumulative number is listed in the number that's in the parentheses or brackets. So on the Sabbath, there were 2 lambs, but it had to be a total of 4 when you add in the daily offering, and so forth, all the way on down the line. So that is something that is helpful. And as you look at this chart, it just makes it a lot easier to understand what is going on here in the book of Numbers. And notice how, as we go through all this, how important the number 7 is. And as we think about the general topic of sacrifices, what it means is that the worshiper is reminded that he or she is the one who should have died, and the animal is taking their place. The animal is the ransom payment which atones for the worshiper's sin. And this is highlighted by the burnt offering, for example. And then the sin offering reminds us that sin causes uncleanness and therefore purification is required. And the guilt offering reminds us that sin is a debt that needs to be repaid. So this gives us a theological framework for what sin is and how God requires that sin must be dealt with. It is, of course, crucial for us to remember that all these requirements and all the repeated sacrifices were replaced and fulfilled by Jesus Christ in his once-for-all sacrifice on the cross for you and for me and for all people, so that all who believe in him have the ransom payment made, have purification for sin, have life in the place of death, and eternal salvation in place of eternal damnation, all because of that tremendous once-for-all sacrifice from our great high priest Jesus Christ, as we talked about this last Sunday. Well, that's enough for one night. We have our Lenten services coming up too, so I hope to be seeing many of you for that, whether in person or online, and may God be with you and bless you. We'll talk to you again.